The Velvet Throne. Mr. Simpkin decided to run away from home. But not for 12 hours. When it was dark, he would sneak out of bed and tiptoe down the stairs. Gobble wouldn't know. He'd be asleep by then, snoring, as usual. The kettle began to whistle. Mr. Simpkin hurried into the kitchen to make Gobble's coffee, just the way he liked it. 4 spoonfuls of sugar, cream, not milk, stirred 5.5 times, no more, no less. The toaster suddenly popped. Mr. Simpkin snatched the toast and buttered it. He had to hurry. Gobble hated cold toast. He was fussy about his food. The boiled eggs were ready too. All 9 of them. Each egg had a little woolen hat to keep it warm.
Hurry up, idiot.
Gobble was awake. He didn't like to wait for his breakfast. Mr. Simpkin's hands shook. He hurried into his brother's bedroom. Here it is. Everything's just right. Gobble tried to sit up in bed. He was very, very fat. The bed sagged. It groaned and creaked.
Help me up. Don't just stand there like a fool.
Mr. Simpkin put the tray on the floor. Then he tried to heave Gobble up onto his pillows. But he couldn't. His arms were too thin, his muscles were too small. He went red in the face as he heaved and strained at the bulging body. Gobble pushed him away.
You're useless. Absolutely useless.
He grunted as he pulled himself up. With shaking hands, Mr. Simpkin put the tray on the bed. 12 pieces of toast with jam and 4 pieces with orange marmalade, your favourite. Mr. Simpkin smiled at his fat brother, but the smile soon fell from his face.
Idiot! I ordered 12 pieces with orange marmalade and 4 with jam.
He picked up a slice of toast and threw it at the wall. For a moment it stuck there, glued to the wallpaper, and then it slid slowly down, leaving a jammy trail behind it.
Clean that up, and then bring me the newspaper. You always forget the newspaper.
Yes, Arnold. Mr. Simpkin scurried off to fetch a sponge. Gobble's name wasn't really Gobble. It was Arnold. But Mr. Simpkin always called him Gobble in his mind. He was too scared to say it out loud. But it made him feel better. He smiled to himself. Arnold would be furious if he knew. Mr. Simpkin fetched the paper as quickly as he could. He still had to make his own breakfast and then rush off to work. He didn't want to be late. While Gobble read the paper in bed, Mr. Simpkin prepared his own breakfast. He wasn't allowed to eat the eggs, or the bread, or the cereals. Last week, while shopping, he'd bought a tin of sheep's eyes by mistake. He thought they were oysters. Gobble had been furious.
You bought them,
Gobble had shouted.
So you eat them.
Mr. Simpkin opened the can and shook the contents onto a plate. The horrible, wobbling eyes slid out with a slurp. They seemed to be staring up at him. The smell was terrible. Mr. Simpkin was hungry, but not that hungry. He just couldn't eat them. He put the plate in the fridge and walked toward the door. Goodbye, Arnold.
It's payday today. Make sure you come straight home with the money. And don't open the packet. I don't want you wasting our wages on rubbish.
No, Arnold. Mr. Simpkin crept off to work. Gobble had never had a job. He just lay in bed eating chocolates and watching television, while poor little Mr. Simpkin slaved away at the fertiliser factory all day. Mr. Simpkin just made it to work in time. He spent all day filling up fertiliser bags. It was hard work. He grew hungrier and hungrier. His stomach rumbled. At lunchtime he had nothing to eat. Gobble wouldn't give him any money to buy food until he'd eaten a can of sheep's eyes. He was too scared to tip them down the drain in case Gobble caught him.
"Aren't you having any lunch?"
asked Tom Richards, the foreman. I'm not hungry," said Mr. Simpkin. He wet his lips and watched sadly as Tom scoffed down his sandwiches. After work, Mr. Simpkin collected his pay packet and walked slowly home. Gobble would stuff the money in his pocket. He'd fill his face with jellies and cakes while Mr. Simpkin watched. He'd tell Mr. Simpkin to eat the sheep's eyes for his tea. The rain drizzled down. Mr. Simpkin walked more and more slowly. He thought about his plans to run away. Why wait until tonight? Why not run away now? Keep the money. It was his after all. He could start a new life. Get another job where Gobble couldn't find him. He could go to a motel for the night. Gobble had thousands of dollars in a tin under the bed. It was all money that Mr. Simpkin had earned. He wished that he could get some of it, but Gobble had never handed over to him. The streets were full of people rushing home. It was cold, but Mr. Simpkin smiled to himself. He tore open his pay packet. The dollar bills were folded neatly. They were all his. Every one. Made him feel terrific to open his own pay packet. He would do it. He decided straight away. He'd go to a motel and book in. He would order an enormous meal. Gobble could eat the sheep's eyes if he wanted. The thought of it made Mr. Simpkin chuckle. A motel, that's where he'd go. But first, he needed to find a toilet. All of the excitement was making him nervous. He needed to go to the loo. Nearby was a park. Mr. Simpkin ran across the wet grass. Soon he was surrounded by trees. It was growing dark. Where was the toilet? There was one around here somewhere. There it was, under the trees. A bluestone building, like a jail. Mr. Simpkin looked at his watch. 2 minutes to 5. He found the men's and hurried inside. Someone had written on the wall. There was scribble everywhere. Mr. Simpkin didn't read it. Graffiti usually said rude things. He tried not to look at the scrawled writing, but he just couldn't help himself. Above his head was scribbled, "This joint gets locked at 5. There was a loud clang and the sound of a key turning. At first, Mr. Simpkin did nothing. And then he realised someone had shut the gate and locked it. He rushed over to the iron gate. It was fixed with a chain and padlock. "Hey, I'm in here." Mr. Simpkin was too embarrassed to shout. Excuse me? Excuse me?" No one answered his call. He was all alone, locked in a public toilet, on a cold and wet night. "Help! Help! Oh, help!" The park was silent. The toilet was silent. He looked up at the roof, where one lonely light glowed in the dark. There was no way out. He was trapped. The night grew colder. Mr. Simpkin shivered and drew his coat around himself. "Help! Help! Help! Help!" There was no answer. He knew no one would come until morning. He looked around for somewhere to sit. The floor was wet and cold. And he was hungry. He started to look at the graffiti. There was another bit. It said, "The best seat in the house." An arrow pointed to one of the cubicles. Mr. Simpkin gave a weak grin. Someone had a sense of humour. He followed the arrow into the cubicle and gasped. The toilet seat was covered in velvet. The bowl shone like gold. The cistern button was a diamond. The toilet was more like a throne than a loo. This was crazy. Why would anyone want to put such a wonderful seat there? Vandals could wreck it in no time at all. He stared around the cubicle. There was another piece of graffiti. It read, "No standing." Suddenly, Mr. Simpkin felt an urgent need to sit down. His legs seemed to make him walk. He shuffled forward and sat on the velvet-lined toilet seat. He tried to stop, but he couldn't. Well, he thought that he couldn't. Maybe he had been feeling a little bit tired. Yes, that was it. Something scuffled in the gloom. He stared at the corner. A shadow moved and scuttered. Mr. Simpkin's heart froze. Little bumps spread across his flesh. A rat! He hated rats. He lifted his feet off the ground. "Shoo!" he said softly. "Scat!" The rat scuttled into a hole. The minutes ticked by. Mr. Simpkin sat watching for the rat, but there was no sign of it. After a while, he noticed more graffiti. There was another piece of writing scrawled above the toilet roll holder. It said, "Rock and roll." He stared at the toilet roll holder. It moved. He was sure that it moved. It gave a little jiggle. Mr. Simpkin shook with fear. Something strange was going on. He wanted to get out of this loo. Someone was playing jokes. And they weren't funny. The toilet roll holder began to jig. Back and forward, up and down, in a regular beat like a musician tapping his feet. It was jigging to silent music. It was beating out a tune. Mr. Simpkin was sure that it was a rock and roll number. Without warning, the jigging stopped. Even though it was cold, Mr. Simpkin began to sweat. He was trapped like a rat in a crazy toilet. He tried to figure it out. There was something strange about the writing on the wall. The first bit of graffiti had said, "This joint closes at 5." And it had. On the dot. Nothing strange about that. But the next one had pointed to the best seat in the house. And it was the best seat. And the weirdest. And then there was the no standing sign, which forced him to sit down. And what about the rock and roll paper holder? It had started to rock and roll. It really had. Or was it just the wind? Or the water pipes shaking it? Mr. Simpkin had the feeling that he was going out of his mind. But then, if you're mad, you're the only one who doesn't know. And he was wondering whether or not he was sane. So he couldn't be mad. Or could he? "Get a grip on yourself, man." There was only one explanation. He tried to push the thought from his mind. He tried to stop thinking it. But the unwanted thought winkled its way into his brain. The graffiti was coming true. Everything written on the wall was happening. Mr. Simpkin's hands began to shake. He rushed over to the locked gate and shook it hard. "Help! Help! Get me out of here!" Mr. Simpkin shouted and yelled. He kicked and screamed. But the empty night gave no answer. Slowly he walked back to the velvet seat and sat down. He closed his eyes tightly. He didn't want to read the walls. He was too terrified to think about it. What was that? Mr. Simpkin opened his eyes and stared. The cubicle door slowly swung outward. There was a big space underneath the door, and just above the gap was scrawled, "Beware of limbo dancers." Mr. Simpkin didn't laugh. His lips were frozen in a bewildered grin. His tongue was stuck to the roof of his dry mouth. His eyes bulged. Suddenly, a dancing, swaying line of people filled the empty building. They seemed to appear from nowhere. They wore crazy hats and blew party squeakers. They clapped their hands and kicked their feet. The line swayed and swerved and approached the cubicle door. One by one, the partygoers leaned back on their heels and passed under the open door. They ignored Mr. Simpkin. He was like an uninvited ghost at a banquet. He sat still, terrified on his velvet seat as the line came back for another limbo. Without warning, a gust of wind slammed the door. Mr. Simpkin winced and closed his eyes. When he opened them, the line of dancers had disappeared. He was alone once more. What was going on? What? Was this a nightmare? Every bit of graffiti was coming true. What else was written there? People wrote terrible things on toilet walls. He looked above his head. Drowned in the dunny at dawn. Mr. Simpkin jumped off his velvet seat and stared down into the water. No, not that! No! He ran over to the corner, as far away from the pan as he could get. He squatted down on the floor, curling up into a tight ball. He closed his eyes and refused to read any more. He tried to sleep, so that he could wake up from this dreadful nightmare. But sleep wouldn't come. He crouched there, not moving, as the minutes and the hours ticked by. His stomach rumbled. His legs were stiff. He thought his ordeal would never end. But at last the first rays of sunlight crept through the iron gate. Dawn. Mr. Simpkin shook his head. He looked around for a weapon. There was nothing. Then his eyes rested on a shape moving along the top of the wall of the empty cubicle. It was that rat. It crept forward. Mr. Simpkin crouched down. What if the rat leapt at him? Flew through the air with bared fangs. It was better not to wait. He stood up and waved his arms. Shoo! Scat! Buzz off! The rat was startled. It reared up on its back legs and slipped. It fell, tumbling into the velvet toilet. With the speed of a cobra, Mr. Simpkin lunged across the floor and pressed the diamond button. The rat disappeared in a gurgling flush. Mr. Simpkin slumped down. The writing had come true. The rat had drowned at dawn. He wondered what else was written. It was no use putting it off any longer. He searched the walls for more graffiti, and he found one more piece. It simply said, "There's no place like home." Without warning, the iron gate was thrown open. Mr. Simpkin took one last look around his prison and fled. There was no sign of a gatekeeper. Who had opened the door? He didn't know or care. He was free. He fled across the park. "There's no place like home, you can say that again," he thought to himself. If he hurried, he might get back before Gobble woke up. He could make Gobble's breakfast especially tasty. He would hand over his pay packet. Gobble might forgive him for taking a night off. And if not, well, he'd just have to take whatever punishment was dealt out. Anything would be better than spending another night in that terrifying toilet. Running away had been a big mistake. He was hungry. He was starving. After he'd fed Gobble, he'd make himself a nice meal of sheep's eyes. Mr. Simpkin stopped running. He walked slowly with heavy steps. His shoulders were hunched as if he carried a great burden. Suddenly he stopped and turned. He started to run back across the grass. The gate of the toilet was still open. He hurried inside and looked at his watch. 2 minutes to 7. He felt inside his pocket and found what he was looking for, a blunt pencil. He took it out and carefully wrote on the toilet wall, "Gobble disappears forever at 7 o'clock." Mr. Simpkin hurried home. He burst into the flat. "Gobble? Are you there? Gobble? Gobble?"